Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Johannseburg Holocaust and Genocide Center's podcast series. My name is Mdunduli, the Center's Education Officer, and welcome to this part 2 of our Focus on Democracy series. The first episode focused on dangerous speech and hate speech. This second episode will focus on gender, particularly looking at the topic of dangerous women, women who fought against liberal democracy. The name Ilse Koch may be familiar to many of you, the infamous concentration camp guard in Buchenwald. Some may remember Pauline Nyiramasuhuko, the first woman charged with genocidal assault in Rwanda by the International Court. And recently, the story of Ashley Babbitt made news around the world, the woman shot dead when storming the U.S. Capitol during the insurrection on January 6th, and women from the Arrow Cross Party, the far-right Hungarian nationalistic party, women who constituted 30% of that party's membership in certain districts. We call these women dangerous women. Though in this podcast, we're taking a broader view than focusing on individuals who have already been vilified by the public. The aim of this podcast is to understand the causes, processes, institutions, and political aspirations that have led women to support anti-democratic and illiberal movements and regimes. In the past and present, dangerous women have been invisible, yet also able to empower themselves. Gendered stereotypes regarding women have facilitated these processes. Dangerous women have opposed traditional roles or managed to put their own agendas in motion within their traditional household roles. Whatever the particular case, they mobilized their privilege against less privileged, minoritized, and persecuted others. In this podcast, 4 international scholars will debunk some misconceptions and look at the complex motivations and aspirations of dangerous women. These women did not passively join anti-democratic parties and movements. They did not blindly follow the examples of their husbands, fathers, or other men. They did not lack their own professional aspirations. In one word, they were not misguided victims of male manipulation, nor did they commit crimes, including participation in wars and genocides, because they acted out sadistic impulses against their supposed feminine nature. Rather, extremist parties and movements have offered them a form of political citizenship that bolstered their social place in regimes founded on the exclusion of others. I am pleased to once again welcome our esteemed experts and panelists to unpack today's topic. We have Director Tali Nates, who is the founder and executive director of the Johannseburg Holocaust and Genocide Center in South Africa. We have Professor Bjorn Krondorfer, who is the director of the Martin Springer Institute and Regents Professor at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, USA. We also have Professor Andrea Petou, who is professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And last but not least, we have Professor Steve Carr, who is the director of the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Purdue University in Fort Wayne, USA. I want to direct my first question to Professor Petou, and it actually links to what I've just said in my introduction. So the presumption of historiography is that women's stories are silenced, forgotten, and their participation in politics is limited. However, in the recent siege of the Capitol Hill in the United States, we saw women being visible. Women who are supporting an anti-modernist agenda, but also women who were very active, not only in hiding the valuable paper ballot slips, That was a very big story. But also there were women who were there as protesters. There were women who actually financed the march itself. And when one of the protesting women showed up wearing dressed up as the Statue of Liberty for that occasion, she wanted to convey a message that she believed previously nobody had listened to. So my question is, what are the structural factors that make women invisible?
Thank you. This is a very important question, and I would like to respond to this in 3 steps. So this invisibility is connected to, first, to the different gendered assumptions we have, secondly, to the different structural factors, and third, related to the blindness in the different historiographies. So as far as the assumptions are concerned, you already mentioned these gender stereotypes that, women are expected to be peaceful, only taking care of the family and not really, going into fights or especially getting involved in politics. And this kind of assumption is coming back again. So because the 68-ish movement somehow questioned this, but again, now with the illiberal turn, we somehow have this feeling that, the women are mostly concerned about the family, which means that they are peaceful. And this is not necessarily the case. So let me move to the issue of the structural factors, because, you can see women if you have got sources as far as archival records, or you have got testimonies, or you have got visual evidence, like you have mentioned in the introduction, that there had this siege of the Capitol Hill had been one of the most photographed and most documented social movement action in the past years, because there were so many cameras all around, which later helped the different justice departments and different police and attorneys to look for those who were actually participating in this siege. But usually when women are participating in politics, they are not in the first row, or they are not in the spaces where the majority of the men are. So just if you look at the different neo-Nazi groups, we see that these women are not necessarily in the front line, but at the back of this movement. They're mostly focusing on charity and cultural activity, which means that they are not producing so much documents which would help the academics to research and to do some work and investigation on their work. And also these kind of structures which make them invisible, that also empowers them. So, for example, in the interwar period, which I'm researching, there were several tea circles where the wives of the influential politicians were taking part, and they made very important decisions about the redistribution of Jewish wealth, for example, or about who is getting married to whom, to the different other aspects. So this was, but of course there was no written material about this. So there is no source, what you would consider real historical source. What you had is some testimonies. So this kind of gendered spaces where women are participating in politics is not producing enough material very often. So the historians and sociologists have to look for alternative spaces and alternative sources to do their research. And let me get to the third point, which is the blindness of the different fellowships. Let me get to the third point, which is the blindness of different scientific inquiries. So if we look at the fascism studies, Holocaust studies, gender studies, or genocide studies, perpetrator studies, we see that all of these different studies have got their own blind spots, and somehow the women as perpetrators and women who are supporting unholy issues and then unholy values, and who are supporting the anti-modernist form of emancipation, they are somehow outside of the framework till very recently. So this you mentioned in your question, this anti-modernist agenda, which is very important, especially thinking about how and why women got mobilized for these illiberal causes. And the important point to stress is that they actually find another value system more appealing, more interesting, more inviting than the liberal politics. And that's something what we need to discuss later on.
Wow. Women's participation in unholy civil society and far-right movements is easy to dismiss and to label the protesters as a mob or deplorable. So there was that famous quote by Hillary Clinton, a basket of deplorables. And there's another term, unverselig. So I'm referencing Angela Merkel, so which means a group that cannot be made better. Or simply to laugh at the tens of millions of women who, in an increasing number, have voted for Donald Trump. That's, for me, that was always fascinating. So my question is, in what sense is the increasing mobilization of women for anti-modernist political movements is a reaction to failed promises of emancipation? And can you give any examples from your own research in answering this question?
So, I can try to respond to that. I think maybe one starting point would be to say that the claims of failed promises of emancipation are sort of the starting point and the reaction to the kind of liberal political modernity. And I think in my own research, I've really been struck by how kind of incendiary language speaking for women ends up replacing the interests of actual women. And for example, I think the accusations of attacks on women and girls get used in dangerous speech to justify attacks upon a targeted group. And we've seen this in the U.S., fears of the, oversexed African-American men preying upon white women justified many lynchings in the U.S. Now, my own research that looked at anti-Semitic allegations of Jewish control over Hollywood, I found that there were numerous stereotypes of Jewish movie moguls that got invoked when discussing the sort of fears of predations upon the purity and innocence of young Christian girls who were traveling to California seeking stardom in Hollywood. So I think these fears use women's purity as kind of a pretext for attacks upon a targeted group, and rarely do these stereotypes acknowledge women's autonomy or agency or their ability to speak or to act as their own subjects. And that's not to say that women don't speak and act as their own subjects, even while participating in these movements. But I think we have to consider the kind of structure around those women who do choose to participate, that in some way the die has already been cast, that the terms have been established, and that the women are simply repeating or mouthing a much more traditional version of femininity that's opposed to many of the advances that have taken place since the 19th and 20th century for women and others.
And then thank you for that, Steve. And then Bjorn?
I could add a few thoughts to it. Clearly, for women who voluntarily support and participate in anti-democratic, illiberal movements, they rather than coerced participation, they do so because they reap some benefits from it. It's not necessarily against their own agenda, although sometimes we read it this way. So part of me kind of disagrees just a little bit with the premise of the question, to say that women's participation in anti-modernist movements, whether it is really because the because of failed promises of the emancipation, whether that is correct, because it assumes that we already know what the final goal is for women's liberation and emancipation, and then we measure everything from the idealized version to what's happening today, and clearly we fail. So maybe it's not so much anti-modernism, but something else that is at stake. And maybe I'll give one or two very short examples. One is women participating in and embracing Nazi policies, which clearly opened for Aryan-identified women. It opened new opportunities for them. I don't think they followed an anti-modernist impulse. I think they rather participated in a very modernist renewal movement when they wanted to participate in restructuring German society along bio-racist and exclusivist and very efficient and then eventually genocidal terms. Now that, in that sense, it made them dangerous to other women, but they also benefited from something that they embraced as a move forward, not necessarily as an anti-modernist one. Or I'm thinking of some of the Hutu women who are accused of participating in the genocide in Rwanda. There's a famous case by Pauline, and I cannot pronounce her last name. I think it's the first woman who was accused by the International Court to participate in genocidal violence and incitement of rape. And I don't think, again, this was women's participation in anti-modernism, but she participated in an ethno-nationalist movement that was a very present-day reaction for remedying the legacies of colonialism. So I think that was an anti-colonial response rather than an anti-modernist response.
So are you saying that there is some emancipation that has taken place? So it's not that women are forced or are silenced, but they choose to. So, for example, if a woman assumes a position of power within a culture that maybe is bad or is oppressive, are you saying there is some emancipation, but they choose to do so they see a benefit in assuming those roles?
So given our topic on gender and quote-unquote dangerous women, the liberal critique of these movements is that women are forced into roles where they are repressed and oppressed, and they don't do this voluntarily. And the three examples I use is saying, like, no, they voluntarily buy into some of this ideology because it does benefit them to some extent.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then in some cases, they actually become perpetrators, and that makes them dangerous.
That makes. So now I want to go to Rwanda, to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in terms of speaking about women perpetrators. So recently, I moderated a conversation about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. As we know, we are in the 100 days of commemorating the 100 days of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And we were having a conversation, and I was lucky to be the moderator of that conversation with three other experts. And the topic of women perpetrators during that genocide came up. So I want to ask Director Tali Nates, can you tell us more about women as perpetrators during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda?
So one of the experts that is a friend of the Johannseburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is Dr. Sarah Brown, that wrote a PhD and book about women perpetrators in Rwanda. And I think I would like to connect to what Andrea said before, that this paradigm shift needed to happen, because in genocide, specifically Rwanda, women were looked as only as victims. So victims of murder, mass murder, victims of rape, victims of sexual abuse, and so on and so forth. And of course they were. Of course they were. But the issue that Dr. Brown and others are calling us to look at is women in other roles. And I will start actually with women as enablers. Women as enablers that are making, for example, the banana beer at home, that are creating the lunch boxes for their husbands, sons, neighbors that are going to work. And going to work was in Rwanda going to kill. So the enabling act, not for one day, not for 2 days, but for over 3 months of creating the atmosphere, the safety in continuing normalcy. It sounds bizarre, but this normalcy of waking up in the morning, making the breakfast, packing the lunch, creating the beer, supporting the husband that is going to kill, come back, supporting the husband, and day after day doing that. So that is really important to speak about, and we don't speak about that enough. By the way, some of it was the same in Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. Wives that kept the house for Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, living in the grounds of Auschwitz I with his wife, with his children. But let's stay in Rwanda and look at women as bystanders, women as rescuers, of course. In our museum, we speak about women, including women in the church, but neighbors and so on, that attempted to rescue, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. But women as perpetrators is really, really interesting, because only about 10% of all perpetrators in Rwanda were women. 90% were men. And some of them were just killers or betrayers or people that helped the Interahamwe or the other killers to keep victims. And some of them, by the way, were also from the church. So you have the church, the Roman Catholic Church helping, and the Roman Catholic Church, helping to kill. But maybe the most famous case is of Valerie Bemeriki, the journalist, the woman journalist of the radio, Television Les Mille Collines, RTLM, Radio RTLM, who was an extremist journalist even before the genocide. She was writing for Interahamwe newspapers before the genocide in 1993 and after. But of course, her role in hate radio, Radio RTLM, is important. And I'll just spend half a minute more just to explain what she did, because it was a live radio. Her voice not only helped with songs and culture and kept the listeners occupied, but she was the one that said where to go and kill. She gave addresses of Tutsi that were not killed yet. By the way, both Hutu and Tutsi were listening to her during the genocide. Hutu to know where to go to kill, and Tutsi to know if their name is called. Because if their name is called, they know that they're coming for them, and then they have to run away. So how horrible can you imagine during these 3 months was that? And she did that until she understood that her life is in danger. She escaped. She escaped to Zaire of them with all the other refugees, and hid sort of in plain sight in the refugee camps. And funnily enough, she admitted then that she was guilty. She very early on in the refugee camp not only admitted she was inciting to genocide, but she even begged for forgiveness. But then she changed her mind. And when she was taken to court in the international court, in the ICTR in Arusha, she did not admit that she was guilty. And she, even though they had recordings of the radio and they played those recordings, her saying, go and kill the cockroaches, don't waste bullets on the cockroaches, just chop the high grass and so on. She still refused to admit, and she was in December 2009 given a life sentence by the court. So complicated cases, and we don't know enough, sadly, about it. But thanks to Dr. Sarah Brown, we know much more.
Yes, there's always something that feels more vicious if the perpetrator is a woman, because maybe of the contrast of the stereotype of the homemaker, and then suddenly we see her as not that. So that contrast always makes it more scary or more frightening when you face a woman perpetrator, like the case you've just described. The contrast makes it very, very scary. If you compare the illiberal political offer with the liberal offer, you see that in some moments, the illiberal offer is much more attractive for the majority of women. Professor Petot's new book on women of the Arrow Cross, one learns that some branches of the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazi Party, 30% of the members were women. In the Hungarian parliament in the past 30 years, women never made up more than 10% of the MPs. Can you explain that puzzle? Why so many women support anti-democratic political forces in certain historical moments, like we know women in apartheid? Yes.
Yeah, I can sort of jump in here, and I think it might be useful just to kind of start out by saying, like, I think not all illiberal political movements are interchangeable or the same. So, I mean, I think there's different nuances and other factors that are going on. But I think in terms of, like, you know, why this kind of the backlash to the more emancipatory politics takes root amongst women or any group for whom I think those interests may not ultimately align in the long term. I think sometimes popular culture does a pretty good job of answering these kinds of questions. And I was thinking in particular about last year's series in the U.S. On the channel FX called Mrs. America, which really captured the backlash in the 1970s against the U.S. Equal Rights Amendment that was people were trying to move forward. And the backlash was led by conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly. I think one of the interesting things about the show was that it focused on how Schlafly's organization, the Stop ERA movement, really marked a rise of the, you know, anti-equality and illiberal politics in the U.S. And that in turn led to some fairly powerful political groups, such as the Moral Majority, that was primarily made up by white Christian evangelicals. And, you know, the Moral Majority was in some ways, I think, still, or whatever its aftermath is anyway, a force within American politics. So, I mean, I think in this particular case, the triumph of this kind of political backlash was in some ways to co-opt, you know, strengthening feminism by sort of, you know, couching these very traditional ideologies of femininity with the trappings of seeming feminism. And I think so, you know, part of the answer to your question, again, I think illustrated by this series, Mrs. America, was that by kind of dressing up these much more retrograde and traditional attitudes about what women should be doing, that, you know, movements like Stop ARA were able to convince millions of women that, you know, such retrograde attitudes were, you know, ultimately in all women's interests. And in some ways, I think, you know, this show depicted, I mean, I hope people don't throw things at me when I say this, but it depicted almost a kind of intersectionality that was occurring within extreme right-wing politics, where women could really assert this traditional ideal of femininity as a way to express both deep-seated racial resentments and at the same time an entrenched opposition to liberal policies and leftist politics.
Yeah, that's interesting. Bjorn?
You asked why so many women support anti-democratic political forces. So I returned to Nazi Germany, to which I alluded earlier. I should probably say in the outset that Nazi policies toward women was quite contradictory. There was not like one particular policy. On the one hand, it was extremely conservative, focusing on women as wives and mothers and childbearers for the correct Aryan race. On the other hand, they did have certain emancipatory elements where they also taught them self-reliance and gave them agency back, especially once World War II started in 1939. Mm-hmm. And of course, in response, women's attitudes towards Nazi Germany was equally contradictory and diverse. So let's think about women's votes. For the first time, German women were allowed to vote or voted and allowed to vote in Germany in 1919. 14 years later, the Nazis wanted to abolish women's voting rights. This was in 1933. There was no mass protest. Rather, what we know is that about 13 million women, German women, actively engaged in some organization related to the Nazi regime. That is 1/3 of the total female population in Germany at the time. So what happened to emancipation? Well, the emancipation by the Nazis was seen as a Bolshevik idea, as an idea of intellectual Jews, as an asocial thought, something just really bad. As historian Wendy Lauer put it, she said, I'm quoting her, the Nazi movement promised to emancipate women from women's emancipation. That is to say, the Nazis couched their ideology, their gender ideology, in terms of liberation of Aryan-identified women. And again, it's like putting a positive spin onto something where some women benefit from it at the cost of others. So what do we know today about women's participation in Nazi Germany? Well, as girls, they were organized in the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädchen as it's called, and they received also paramilitary training there. Not as much as the boys, but some. We know women supported their perpetrator husbands. We know women bought into the ideology of racial purity. We know that women held leadership positions in the conquest of the East. We know women served as guards in the concentration camps and so on and so forth. So I'm using these examples to also allude to what Tali and Andrea said earlier, that we need to begin thinking of women not just as the victims of a illiberal dictatorial regime, but also as culpable agents within it. And that discussion has shifted in the last 10, 20 years, and it's good to recognize it.
But just a follow-up question. In the patriarchal, so much of the world is still patriarchal. It's still a man's world. So can we blame women who have to survive? Is it not more of a matter of surviving as a woman in a patriarchal world? And so you assume if you can find, wherever you find power or agency, you'll take it because you have to survive. You have to raise children. Women have more interest in most situations. Women have more interest in the children than the man. And so she has to protect the children in this patriarchal, sexist, misogynistic system. So she'll take the power wherever she gets it for survival. Can we not look at it that way?
You could, and I would be happy for Andrea to jump in there too. You could, but it's one term that I have worked with recently is a term that Michael Rothberg uses. It's called implicated subject, saying like there are different levels of implication in political systems that are repressive. I mean, you could use that idea in that way. And so rather than just have the stark perpetrator-victim dichotomy, to really differentiate between the different agencies people have at certain moments of time.
Can I just jump in saying that it's a very important question what you were raising, because blaming women that they are not all progressive and running out to the street and burning their bras is actually informed by a certain assumption, right? That this is beneficial to them. And your question actually points out that there are moments and there are contexts. There are certain moments where this is the only resource what these women have. So there is this term patriarchal bargain, which is Kandioti's term, where she actually explains that there are moments when this bargain is very useful because the lack of power gives the power when the women are actually accepting certain conditions of this bargain. But here comes the question, and I think we have to connect it to the theme of this particular podcast series, that when comes the moment when this patriarchal bargain is actually either sleepwalking into a direction which actually leads to a genocide at a certain point, or is it the only refuge or the only resource of empowerment? So let me give you one example. So if you look at the families of different refugees and migrants, you see that the family has got a kinship, has a very different value than in the liberal mainstream discourse, where family and kinship is not really considered as important. Moreover, it's sometimes considered as dangerous. So in that context, this implicated subject, what Bjorn was quoting from Rothberg, is actually a very good way to understand that when we are speaking about this, the gender stereotypes and gender roles, we always have to take into consideration the particular context and the particular historical period. So that's why I think our discussion is important, because it actually brings together those elements which are similar, different as far as the gendered roles, stereotypes, and expectations are concerned when we are talking about genocide, perpetration, mass killing, that this can be a sleepwalking if we just informed by the traditional stereotype that either women are just interested in family and taking care of the children, or they are just using what they have, right? So here we have got this double trap what needs to be avoided.
So if you could choose one life story of a woman whose life story you think sheds light on the issue of visibility and invisibility of women in the illiberal movements, whom would you choose? I'll start with Bjorn.
I'm moving to the S context. January 6th, insurrection, capital. A woman who was very invisible became very visible is Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran from San Diego who tried to break into the Capitol, climbed through a window, was shot. She got her fame by participating in an insurrectionist movement only at the moment of her death in many ways. So there's visibility and invisibility at the same time. A very visible person is Betsy DeVos. She became U.S. Secretary of Education in 2017 under the Trump administration. It is no accident she was put into this position because she belongs to a very wealthy family clan, the DeVos family clan, that has given millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to right-wing causes, churches and political structures and organizations, among others, to dismantle public schooling and replace it with what we call here in the United States the charter school movement, which is the privatization of the school, so that you don't have to follow certain federal guidelines in education, like what is now prohibited, racial discrimination according to sex and religion and gender and so on and so forth, and bring back prayer to school and bring back the preference of one religion over others in the school system, which you can't do in federal schools. Hence the push towards privatizing school, which he was totally in favor and did everything to make this possible, dismantling public schools and promoting this. I'd say she's a good example for high visibility at a certain moment for women in a leadership position who really can make changes. And we can see it as a pattern to hollow out democratic structures. In other words, like what we say in America, letting the fox guard the hen house is pretty much what Betsy DeVos was doing as an education secretary. There would be two short examples.
And then Steve?
So my example is Elizabeth Dilling. My colleague Chris Erickson here at Purdue University Fort Wayne has written about Dilling. Dilling, even before Schlafly embodied what Dr. Erickson called the feminine counterpunch, which articulated a kind of rabid right-wing anti-communism throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that really presaged the later McCarthyite attacks of the 1950s. Again, radical anti-communist kind of smear campaigns against people. And I think, Dilling's a really interesting example because she kind of set the mold for this kind of feminine, conservative talking head, anticipating not just Phyllis Schlafly, who I mentioned earlier, but even more recent media provocateurs such as Laura Ingraham and Ann Coulter here in the U.S. context anyway.
Yes, Ann Coulter is very interesting. And then now, just to finish up, in terms of everything we've been speaking about, are there any recommendations that you can share with us? I'll start with Tali, Director Nates.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking that a recommendation must be to continue to research, to continue to learn, to continue to educate, because this was such a marginalized topic for so many years that we have a lot to catch up on. And specifically coming from South Africa and learning about our own history, may it be colonialism or apartheid or post-apartheid, I think the role of women is still really marginalized and needs a focus, both in education and learning and teaching.
Yes. And then Professor Petro, Andrea?
Thank you. I think that when we are talking about these dangerous women, very often those women are actually suffering because of the structural inequalities, because of the employment situation, because of the care work, what they have to do. And what actually the present situation fails to them is offering a kind of enchanted vision of the future. And I would say that politicians should think about giving this kind of vision for the future, which was, of course, present at the end of the 19th century. The social democratic and progressive movements were actually getting support because this kind of vision, enchanted vision of the future, was present. And for us academics, I think I just would like to support Tali's suggestion that we have to actually do more research and to point out that, this has been there, and there are comparative elements, there are different instances and cases of the past from which we can actually learn, and we can talk about this in an understandable, also enchanting language to a wider public, what this podcast also tries to do.
Yes. And then, Bjorn, maybe a little response? Yes.
I'm sure our listeners by now realize that the issue of gender and what we call in this podcast dangerous women is by far more complex and complicated than we could possibly cover in our 50 minutes or so. But here's one recommendation. We need to name accurately the extent of women's oppression, but also bid farewell to the myth of women's political innocence.
That's a good point. And then Professor Carr, Steve?
I mean, I just would recommend a healthy dose of skepticism and really kind of maybe questioning some of the assumptions and the pretexts that come with much of the way in which, political discourse both speaks for women as well as how it might create seeming opportunities for women to participate, right? I mean, just going back to what we were saying before, I mean, one question about the failed promises of emancipation, well, failed promises for whom, really? When we talk about modernity, I think we need to sort of step back and say, who is, is this modernizing for whom? And, clearly the example that Bjorn gave earlier, I think is an example where, much of the kind of retrograde attitudes for women at the time were sort of couched in terms of, hey, this is better than what you had before when you had the vote, right? So I think, basically when we look at these appeals, to be able to kind of dig a little deeper and think about what's the meaning, what are the assumptions behind those appeals that are getting made.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you all for this conversation. And we'll continue this dialogue in our next podcast. So thank you very much for your time and for being here.
Thank you, Madhu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And for you, the listener, thank you for joining us in today's podcast. Please be sure to tune in to the next part of this series on our focus on democracy with our experts and panelists. If you have any questions for the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and our experts in today's conversation, please send them to us, and we'll make sure to include those answers in our future podcasts, which you can find on our SoundCloud page. And please be sure to visit our website, which is www.jhbholocaust.co.za for more information and resources. For more information on Andrea Petow's latest book, Women in the Arrow Cross, please visit www.palgrave.com and type the title of the book, Women in the Arrow Cross, or simply use the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Director Tali Nate, Professor Bjorn Krondorfer, Professor Andrea Petow, and Professor Steve Carr. Keep well and safe. Thank you.